Senator from Kentucky.
I rise in opposition to raising the debt ceiling.
The Senate's in a quorum call.
I ask unanimous consent that we vitiate the quorum call.
Without objection. Senator from Kentucky.
I rise today in opposition to raising the debt ceiling. I rise in particular in opposition to raising the debt ceiling without getting any sort of spending reform or budgetary reform in return. In fact, it will be completely the opposite. We will be raising the debt ceiling in an unlimited fashion. We will be giving President Obama a free pass to borrow as much money as he can borrow in the last year of his office. No limit, no dollar limit. Here you go, President Obama, spend what you want. We do this while also exceeding what are called budget caps. We've been trying to have spending restraint in Washington. It hasn't worked very well, but at least there are some numbers that government is not supposed to exceed. These include spending caps for military spending as well as domestic spending. When I first arrived in 2010, I was part of a movement called the Tea Party movement. We came into prominence, and I was elected primarily because I was concerned about the debt, worried about the debt that we were leaving to our kids and our grandkids, worrying that we were destroying the very fabric of the country with debt. We came here in 2010, and we negotiated and negotiated. And the President Obama said, I won't negotiate with you. He says, I won't negotiate with a gun to my head. The media all said, you just always have to raise the debt ceiling. It's irresponsible to use that as leverage to get reform. But you know what? We did get reform. The conservatives put forward something called cut, cap, and balance. It was passed overwhelmingly in the House, blocked in the Senate, but ultimately there was something passed called sequestration, which put caps on both military and domestic spending. And it did slow down the rate of growth of government for a little while. This is the problem with Congress. Congress will occasionally do something in the right direction, and then they take one step forward and two steps back. In 2013, we gave up on the sequester, and we added back in about $60 billion worth of money. Now we're doing the same thing again. We're going to add back in, this time, $80 billion, $50 billion in 2016, another $30 billion in 2017. We're doing the opposite of what we should be doing. We should be using the leverage of the debt ceiling, saying, we're not raising it again until you reform your ways, until you begin spending only money you have. Instead, we're doing the opposite. We're saying, here, Mr. President, you can raise the debt as much as you want. You can spend as much as you want while you're in office, and we're going to do nothing. And in fact, we're going to help you. We're going to exceed the caps so everybody gets what they want. So everyone in Washington is going to get something. The right's going to get more military money. The left's going to get more welfare money. The secret handshake goes on, and the American public gets stuck with the bill. Now, I think one of the most important things we do is defend the country. If you ask me to prioritize the spending, I would say we got to defend the country above and beyond and before all else. But that doesn't mean we're stronger or safer if we're doing this from bankruptcy court. I think the number one threat to our country, the number one threat to our security is debt. It's this piling on of debt. The debt threatens our national security, and yet we just want to pile it on, pile it on. This deal will do nothing but explode the debt. In fact, it doesn't even limit how much the debt can go up. We're giving the president a blank check. We're in the middle of a filibuster. This filibuster will go on till about 1 o'clock in the morning, and then we will find out who the true conservatives in this town are. If you're a conservative, you will say, there is no way I'm going to vote to give an unlimited power to the president to borrow money. If you're a conservative, you're going to say, we shouldn't be exceeding the budget caps. If anything, we should be passing more stringent budget caps. It disappoints me greater than I can possibly express that the party that I belong to, that should be the conservative party, doesn't appear to be conservative. This is a big problem. I've asked about this. I'm traveling the country, and I ask Republicans everywhere. I've yet to meet a single Republican who supports this deal. In the House, they voted on this yesterday. You know what the vote was? 2-1 among Republicans to say this is a god-awful deal and we shouldn't touch it with a 10-foot pole. It's a terrible deal. House Republicans understood this. We should be doing the opposite. We should be taking the leverage of saying we're not going to raise the debt ceiling unless we get reform. Instead, we went to the president and said, here, raise the debt ceiling as much as you can possibly spend over the next year, and we'll let you exceed the budget caps. It's irresponsible. It shows a lack of concern for our country and for the debt, and it should go down in defeat. When I ran for office in 2010, the debt was an enormous issue, and the debt was $10 trillion. Some of us in the Tea Party were concerned because it had doubled in the last 8 years. It doubled from 5 to 10 under a Republican administration. And many of us were adamant that Republicans needed to do a better job. We had added new entitlement programs. We had added new spending, and the deficit got worse under Republicans. Now we're under a Democrat president, and it's set to double again. This president will add more to the debt than all of the previous presidents combined. So we're going to go from $10 trillion now to nearly $20 trillion. We may get close to $20 trillion, and now that we've increased the debt ceiling an unspecified amount, we may well get to $20 trillion by the time this president leaves. Is it a problem? Some people say that's just a big number. I don't know what $1 trillion is. Well, if you want to imagine $1 trillion, take $1,000 bills and put them in your hand. $1,000 bills, 4 inches high, is $1 million. But if you want to have $1 trillion in $1,000 bills, it would be 63 miles high. We're talking about an amount of money that is hard to fathom, and you say, what does that mean? How does that hurt me or my family? Economists say that we are losing 1 million jobs a year to the burden of debt. Economists also say when your debt becomes as large as your economy, that you are in a worrisome place. That when the debt is as large as the economy, there's a possibility that you may enter into a period when you might suffer a panic or a collapse or a burden so great that your economy can't withstand it. 2008, we were very close to a panic. I think we get closer with each day. The number one priority up here shouldn't be trying to scrounge around and find new money to spend. It should be trying to conserve. It should be doing something that some say is radical, but I say is the absolute essence of common sense, and that is we should spend what comes in. So often up here, things become partisan, and people just want to point fingers and say, oh, it's that party that did it. They're the ones responsible for the debt. But I want to let you in on a secret. This is a secret that goes on and on and on up here. It is something I call the unholy alliance. It is the unholy alliance between right and left. They both have sacred cows they want to spend money on. So instead of saying, you know what, the debt is a real problem and we both have to conserve in both areas, they both get together secretly and raise the money for their sacred cows. So on the right, we are busting the limits because the right wants more military spending. The left wants more for welfare. The unholy alliance, a secret handshake, and what gets worse? The debt. We're borrowing $1 million every minute, and it's not going to end in a pretty way. What do other conservatives have to say about this deal? Steve Moore at the Heritage Foundation writes, it's the worst budget deal to be negotiated by the GOP since George H.W. Bush violated his No New Taxes pledge in 1990. Rush Limbaugh says, the Republican Party cannot campaign by running around blaming the Democrats for destroying the budget, for overspending, for threatening the very fabric of the country. They can't do it because they're now complicit. Here's the thing, we can't point fingers and say, oh, the Democrats are the big spenders. We now, by this deal, become complicit. We become equally guilty of supporting new debt. Now, some say, well, gosh, you've got to raise the debt ceiling, right? If you don't raise the debt ceiling, there'll be default. Hogwash. Do you know how much money comes into this place every month? Through taxes. About $250 billion comes in taxes. You know what our interest payment is? About $30 billion. Might be as high as $60, $70, $80 billion. there is never not enough revenue to pay for interest. People say, well, we couldn't pay for everything. And I say, well, maybe we shouldn't spend it on everything. We have plenty of money that comes in every month to spend on interest, to spend on Medicare, to spend on Social Security, and to spend on soldier salaries and Veterans Affairs, and little else. But maybe government shouldn't be doing much else. These are the questions we have to ask. What would happen if the debt ceiling didn't go up? You'd have a balanced budget. How bad would that be? If your debt ceiling didn't go up, you would spend what comes in. That's what every American family does. You spend what comes in. I think this is absolutely what we need to do. But even myself, I'm willing to compromise. So I've put forward a compromise. I've put forward a compromise that we tried in 2011. It's called cut, cap, and balance. My compromise would cut the deficit in half in 1 year, a dramatic lessening of the burden of debt. That's the cut. The cap is that my bill would actually cap spending at 18% of GDP. What does that mean? 18% of the total amount of money spent in the economy. Why do we pick 18? Because that leads to a balanced budget. The last part of my bill, cut, cap, and balance, is that we would pass a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution. And I've kind of jokingly said, but probably seriously, if we pass a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution, we pass term limits, I'll go back to being a doctor, which was my first love anyway. But we've got to fix the country. We're destroying the country with debt. We're drowning in a sea of debt, and neither party seems to be concerned with it anymore. So what I would do is I would say, yes, I'll compromise. I'll raise the debt ceiling under those three conditions. Cut the deficit in half, cap the spending, and pass a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution. And people say, well, there aren't the votes for that. Why don't we have a vote? Why don't we allow a vote on cut, cap, and balance, the conservative alternative to this deal that we've got on the floor? Why don't we vote on an alternative? Because there won't be any amendments allowed. This will be pushed through without amendments. And I really object to that. This is supposed to be the body of deliberation. We're supposed to be able to deliberate over whether or not how we're going to fix the problems of the country. And I think this is the #1 threat to us. We're accumulating debt at $1 million every minute. Someone's got to stand up and do something about it. Taxpayers for Common Sense says about this, we're not a fan of this new agreement. Cato writes, the Gipper, Ronald Reagan's ghost, is probably looking down from heaven at the new budget deal between congressional leaders and the Obama administration and saying, there they go again. So let's rephrase the question. What do advocates of fiscal restraint get in exchange for raising these spending caps? Well, if you peruse this agreement, it's apparent they don't get anything. So what we have traded is an increase in the debt ceiling, not just an increase, an unspecified increase in the debt ceiling. We have said to President Obama, you can spend as much money as you want throughout the rest of your presidency, no limits. The National Taxpayers Union writes, if the question on the budget and debt ceiling package is deal or no deal, taxpayers should clearly opt for the latter. While the agreement contains a few meritorious provisions, it fails other sufficient savings and structural reforms necessary to address our nation's $18.1 trillion debt problem. The debt is without question the #1 problem in the country. We will have a vote this evening, and that vote will be, do you care? Are you willing to do something to slow it down? Do you think we ought to use the leverage of the debt ceiling to slow down spending? Or are you a profligate spender who will vote to bust the caps and who will vote to give President Obama unlimited borrowing authority? I think it's a clear-cut question. I will vote no, and I will continue this filibuster as long as there are enough votes here to allow it to continue. At this point, I'd like to ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of my bill, Cut, Cap, and Balance, which is calendar number 274 S2182. I further ask that there be an hour of debate equally divided in the usual form, that following the use or yielding back of time, the bill be read a third time and passed, and that the motion to reconsider be made and laid upon the table.
Is there objection?
Reserving the right to object, Mr. President.
Senator from Oregon.
Mr. President, the Senate is now considering a bipartisan budget agreement. And I believe it's important to pass that bipartisan effort to avoid catastrophic default and to put an end to the mindless sequestration and pass funding to keep the government open. Regrettably, because I often agree with my friend from Kentucky and we team up on so many issues, the request to take up the cut, cap, and balance legislation is a step in the wrong direction. When you push for cut, cap, and balance in this context, you're really pushing for default and recession and joblessness, because that is what all of the independent financial authorities tell us is what's ahead if we don't act here in the United States Senate. The desire to set aside what we're working on and pursue this other legislation is specifically an approach that would throw aside the bipartisan agreement before the Senate. This bipartisan effort is exactly the kind of bipartisan work where Democrats and Republicans come together to tackle a major issue. The American people expect their leaders to find common ground on key issues. That's what this legislation does. And for these reasons, Mr. President, I object.
Objection is heard.
Mr. President.
Senator from Kentucky.
I agree with the senator from Oregon that bipartisan agreement is necessary in this body, but I think we have in this agreement bipartisan agreement in the wrong direction. The bipartisan agreement we need is to conserve across the board for both sides to say that our sacred cow, whether it's military on the right or domestic spending on the left, that they all will have to be conserved. We won't be able to spend money that we don't have. And I think we're becoming weaker as a nation the more we borrow. If we pass this bill, it isn't a difference or a choice between calamity and continuing to add to the debt, which this bill will do. I fully believe that we can continue to make our payments. We have $250 billion a month that comes in. Interest payments are $30 billion. There's absolutely no reason why we would ever default. In fact, I have a bill called Default Protection Act, which would ensure that Social Security and Medicare and our soldier salaries and the interest on the debt were paid for. So I think what we should be doing is doing the opposite kind of compromise. Right and left should come together and say, you know what, I really want spending on this, and right says, I really want spending on the military, and they should come together and say, you know what, we don't have any money. We're borrowing $1 million every minute. So I think this bipartisan compromise goes in the wrong direction. What I would ask for is a bipartisan compromise to actually save money and borrow less. Thank you, Mr. President.